Today we're going to be talking about the problem of evil. The problem of evil is a positive argument for atheism. Atheism comes from a Greek word, a meaning alpha, as in without or no negation of, plus theos, which is God. Possible meanings of the term is either no God, the belief that God does not exist, or without God, a lack of belief in God. The problem with the second definition is it is not a position, it is merely an autobiographical description of a psychological state. It is not distinct from agnosticism. This makes the soft agnostic, the one who says, I don't know, an atheist, and most agnostics would reject this. St. Augustine's definition of evil is defined as a privation or lack of good. For example, it is, the dark is absence of light, cold is the absence of warmth, like a hole in a shirt. God created everything, evil is a thing, therefore God created evil. St. Augustine's answer to this problem is that premise 2, evil is a thing, is actually not a thing. Evil is a lack of something, a privation of good. The logical version of the problem of evil is this: it's impossible that God and suffering can coexist. Like the irresistible force, the immovable object. If one exists, the other does not. The coexistence of suffering and a God who is all good and all powerful is logically impossible. Since suffering obviously exists, it follows that God does not exist. The probabilistic version of the problem of evil. It's improbable that God and suffering coexist. Very unlikely given the amount of evil and suffering in the world. The amount of suffering in the world makes it improbable that an all-loving, all-powerful God exists. In other words, it seems highly unlikely that God could have moral sufficient reasons for permitting the amount of suffering that exists within the world. Therefore, the suffering in the world provides evidence that there is no God. In response to the logical version of the problem of evil. The claim of the logical version is that the following statements are logically inconsistent. In an all-loving, all-powerful God exists, suffering exists. Why are 1 and 2 logically inconsistent? 1 and 2 are not explicitly contradictory. For example, an irresistible force and an immovable object. There must be some hidden assumptions. If the atheist is thinking that there must be some implicit contradiction between 1 and 2, he must be making some assumptions which bring out the contradiction and make it explicit. Some of the hidden assumptions. Taken from number 3, because God is an all-powerful, he can create a world without suffering. Because God is all good, he would want to create a world without suffering. From these hidden assumptions, it follows that the suffering should not exist, but suffering does exist. Therefore, God that is all-powerful and all good cannot exist. Let's look at hidden assumption 3. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world that he wants. Is this necessarily true? Not if it at least possible that people have a genuine free will. Forced choice is logically impossible. It's like making a round square or a married bachelor. God's omnipotence does not mean that he can bring about the logically impossible. Unlike the laws of nature, the laws of logic and the laws of morality stem from the nature of God and cannot be violated. If you say that God can do what is logically impossible, then there is no problem with the coexistence of God and suffering. Free will is, at least, possible. Since it's at least possible that people have free will, then the assumption of point 3 that an all-powerful God can create any world that he wants is not necessarily true. Hidden assumption 4 is, if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering. Is this necessarily true? It is at least possible that God could have good overriding reasons for permitting the suffering that exists in the world. We all know of instances where we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good. For example, going to the dentist. It sucks, but later on you're glad you did it. The atheist might assume that God could bring about the greater good directly without suffering, but that might not be possible given human free will. Some goods, for example, moral virtues, can be achieved only through the free cooperation of people. It may be very well possible that a world without suffering is better overall than a world without suffering. Whether that is true or even probable does not matter, so long as it is possible. It is enough to defeat the atheist claim that it is logically impossible for God and suffering to coexist. The response to the probabilistical version of the problem of evil. The amount of suffering in the world makes it improbable that an all-loving, all-powerful God exists. Number one is, we're not in a good position to say that it's improbable that God lacks good reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. The chief purpose of life is not happiness, but the knowledge of God. Number two is, relative to the full scope of evidence, God's existence is probable. Whether improbability suffering may cast upon God's existence is simply outweighed by the arguments for the existence of God. Christianity entails doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and suffering. Read 2 Corinthians 4:16-18 for this example. In summary, the probabilistic argument requires probability judgments that are way beyond our ability. It fails to take into account the full scope of evidence, and it diminishes in force when it comes to the Christian God. Conclusion is, since neither the logical version nor the probabilistic version of the problem goes through, the intellectual problem fails as a disproof of God. The problem of evil is a problem for atheists. Much of the suffering in the world consists of evil acts which people perpetuate on one another. If this is true, we may argue as follows: that if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Evil does exist, therefore objective moral values do exist. Some things are evil, therefore God exists. If the atheist is claiming that suffering ought not to be, he is making a moral judgment that it is impossible only if God exists.